Bob Dudley, it's great to have you again. Some investors are pressing IOC majors to exit certain carbon-intensive assets, but these assets simply move off their balance sheets and onto the balance sheets of private operators. These private operators are hidden away from the public eye, so the emissions are still there. Do you think this sort of investor pressure is self-defeating, really?
Well, a little bit it would be, because all you do is move it out, and then they can't focus on it as much where they can with the IOCs. IOCs will only make decisions if it's economic and it makes sense. So it's not so much the pressure that comes along. There are late life assets and it's time to divest to others, but it doesn't make them go away.
Well, on that note, Bob, how important is the oil and gas decarbonization charter, which was launched last year at the COP28 in Dubai, in expanding decarbonization efforts to encompass a greater number of those private players and other NOCs?
So I chair something called the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, OGCI, and the companies there were working on this and committed to it. But by the time we got to COP28, more than 50 companies had signed up for it. I personally think it's about the most practical thing that came out of COP in years. It was actually targets set, private industry there, helpful. It was only 3 years ago where oil and gas companies were not welcome at a COP. I think the UAE did a great job in saying, no, this is important. Dr. Sultan was a great leader in that, and I think it actually will change the world. The IOCs, the big ones, are well on their way with these targets, but many of the NOCs didn't even measure it. They needed help, and so it's brought a group of people together, and many of the companies are helping each other, moving it forward, and there'll be more that join. They've all set a baseline, which is amazing for many of the companies, so I think it's off to a great start, and OGCI is helping monitor and manage that going forward. So to me, really important development for the world of energy.
Eliminating routine flaring is one of the low-hanging fruits, yet the industry hasn't been able to really nail that in the past few years and decades. The new target set at COP28 is to zero in on routine flaring by 2030. What do you think is needed in order for the industry to reach this target this time around? Why hasn't this been tackled firmly and decisively by the industry much earlier? And what really needs to be done in order for the industry to really nail it this time?
Well, most of the IOCs, if not all of them, the OGCI members are well on that and have done it effectively. Routine flaring, sometimes you have to prevent danger. The big developments that have happened, I would say, in the last 2 or 3 years, not back 5 or 10 years, is the ability to see them with satellites and measure them. You know where the issue is, and now the companies are working together, particularly with other big NOCs that just didn't even think about it. It's not something you can see, you can't taste it, you can't smell it, but when you get the technology that can identify it, that's going to change the world. So that's why it's taken a while, and now that new technology is going to have a lot of companies focusing on it. And some of them need help from their IOC partners, and that's also happening. So I think we're going to get there.
Hopefully. Moving on to low carbon hydrogen, it's definitely a potential solution in the future. It's technically feasible, yet it's still very costly at the moment. Many experts point to the fact that there hasn't been any demand materializing. So do you think this is a classic situation of what comes first, supply or demand, the classic situation of what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, some companies are moving forward developing hydrogen, blue hydrogen, but also important is blue ammonia. They're very linked because ammonia you can actually ship. Hydrogen is a little bit harder to move around. So I'm on the board of Aramco, and they have been developing blue hydrogen and ammonia and working with Japan and South Korea. But I have to say, those markets have been quite slow to develop. And they're the ones who really want to do this really well. But you've got to match supply and demand. Otherwise, companies will just develop it and have it for nowhere to go. So like many things in the old days, LNG, even solar, you have to match supply, demand, and economics. And it's moving in that direction, but the development of markets for hydrogen and blue ammonia is slower.
Do you think that will pick up for demand for blue ammonia in the next couple of years?
I think particularly in Asia, I think in South Korea and Japan it will. They're probably going to be leaders in this, and then there'll be localized leaders in industry that might need it for certain plants that they have near the coast and things like that. But it's going to take a while because the economics really are not competitive yet.
Back in 2017, OGCI has launched a OGCI Climate Investments to create a $1 billion plus fund to invest in upcoming technologies, companies, and projects that could accelerate decarbonization, not just in the energy sector, but in other sectors as well. Give us an overview of what the fund has deployed its investments in, and what any milestones you've achieved in that fund over the last few years.
Yes, well, it's closed out, so it's invested $1 billion now and invested in 35 companies. It's actually started a second fund, a decarbonization acceleration fund, because people see how good due diligence OGCI did, and they're investing now. So it's not just OGCI, another. And we're looking at a third one coming up. So I'll give you a good example of a company that might not be around, that OGCI invested heavily in. Other people have, called GHG Sat, Canadian company. Put satellites up around the world and identified, monitored methane leakage. And that's changed the world, for example. These were all early life. It invested in a cement company that sequestered CO2 when it cured. That was a new thing. There's a whole set of CCS companies. So it was all very, very early life, long life. The new funds will be later life, proven technology. So I'm just really proud of what the team has done. $1 billion of investment, 35 companies, now moving on to a second and a third set of funds is going to change the world. And I think OGCI is one of the more thorough ones. You can imagine 12 companies have to do diligence and approve things. They really understand the technology. And I don't think funds around the world are doing that.
Part of the solution, Bob, is how we view carbon as a material with an inherent value rather than just a byproduct that we want to get rid of. A lot of work is being done on carbon capture technologies and on storage and sequestration options, but is there enough work being done on looking at how other industries can actually use the carbon capture?
Well, so carbon capture and sequestration, a lot of it is pumping it into the ground, holding it forever below ground. That's one kind. But carbon fiber research and what the use of that is, graphene, things like that, there's work going on that. It's quite competitive and quite secretive, but there's a lot of research going on in companies on that. That's one. I laugh at the use of CO2 for carbonation of beverages. There's some of that going on, and there's been shortages of that. But the really big, and then there's the direct air capture, which a number of companies are doing. Oxy is one of them. So there's a whole spectrum with carbon sequestration. The economics of some of it still have a ways to go, but if you can do it at scale, particularly, I'll give you an example with Saudi Arabia, they can gather CO2 and inject it into the ground, and it's quite a lot of scale. And then to set a market here, they're in discussions with some countries who would like blue hydrogen and ammonia that they can provide, and then the countries are saying, can we ship liquid CO2 back to you in Saudi Arabia so you can put it in the ground, because we don't have anywhere to do it. To me, that's a great indication of people are starting to think about a market that most people don't know about. It hasn't happened, but it's close, I think.
Finally, Bob, what are your expectations for COP29 in Baku this year? Should the conference focus more on reviewing implementation of past initiatives and goals rather than just new announcements of new goals and new targets?
Well, it's easy to announce targets, but it's not what you say, it's what you do. And what we've done coming out of Top 28 is something that's actually practical and doing and making it, and definitely the monitoring it should happen both at 29 and 30, which will be in Brazil. You know, for years, industry wasn't invited to COP. And so those in industry used to think it's just a political talk shop. I hope in Baku, they build on these practical things coming out of 28. It'll happen anyway, but I think that's really important. But just adding more and more targets, to me, makes people feel better. But there's a difference. And so I think focusing on the implementation, the monitoring, the changing of what energy companies do is one part of it. But COP is not just about oil and gas. I mean, it's supposed to be about everything, steel, aluminum, other things. I'm not quite an expert on what they're doing, but if they can get practical in the way that oil and gas is coming out of 28, that would be good. But just setting more targets is, it's not going to help, in my view.